There was one quiet instance, without a title, without any uproar, when the very first lie entered. But by then it was too late. No one announced it. It came in the form of a whisper. Or perhaps it was heavily suggested, or constantly reiterated, until it felt inescapable. For example, "You're too much. You ask too many questions. You should already know." In this manner you began to shrink, trying to squeeze yourself into a room whose walls were never meant to encapsulate your being. You labeled it growing up. You labeled it becoming real. Yet all this while you were carefully constructing a life around ideas and ideals that were never yours. And on some quiet night, maybe tonight, you notice how gently that first lie still gasps for air. And you realize just as much of you is ready to finally stop listening. You don't remember inviting it in. It arrived without a name, without announcement, just a quiet suggestion, carried by someone else's voice, repeated not forcefully but with a rhythm that felt familiar. You might have heard it in passing, maybe twice, maybe more. A sentence spoken casually in the background of a conversation you weren't even really listening to, or woven into an ad that blinked across your periphery, repeated like ambient noise. At first, you didn't respond. It wasn't yours. It didn't match your reasoning, didn't sit comfortably in the center of your beliefs. You noticed it briefly and then dismissed it. But it didn't leave. It lingered. And that's the strange thing about thoughts that don't belong to you. They don't always knock. Some of them slip in through repetition. Some wear the clothes of agreement, the posture of something you think you've heard before. They don't require belief, not at first. They only require your indifference. And so it stayed. This tiny, borrowed thought. It didn't argue. It didn't demand your trust. It merely repeated itself. Not with volume, but with patience. It waited in the corner of other thoughts, blending in, echoing faintly when you were tired or distracted or alone. And over time, something subtle shifted. You didn't notice it right away. The thought didn't feel foreign anymore. It started to sound like your own voice, not identical, just similar enough to pass. You began to think it, then repeat it, and then one day you said it out loud, casually, as if it had always been yours. You believed it, not because it was true, but because it was familiar. This is how belief begins, not in grand revelations or dramatic realizations, but in the quiet acquisition of echoes. Repetition is not neutral. The brain doesn't file repeated ideas separately. It files them as easier to access, more fluent, more comfortable. And comfort, to the subconscious, is almost indistinguishable from truth, so you begin to carry it, this little phrase. Maybe it's harmless, maybe it's something small, like a judgment about yourself or the world. I always mess things up. People like that can't be trusted. This is just how things are. It doesn't matter if you disagree intellectually. The thought has already made a home beneath your awareness, and that is where it begins to grow. Not loudly, not urgently, but steadily. Every time you revisit it, the brain makes the path a little easier to walk. The neurons that fire together start to link. The phrase becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a belief, not through logic, but through ease. The brain prefers fluency over friction, and once a belief becomes fluent, it bypasses scrutiny altogether. You begin to see evidence for the thought, not because the world has changed, but because your attention has. The mind, seeking to confirm its inner map, starts to filter your experience. That's confirmation bias, but it doesn't feel like bias. It feels like reality. And so, something that was once alien becomes familiar. Something that was once external becomes internal. A whisper becomes a worldview. You might still think you chose this thought, that you arrived at it rationally, carefully, with intention, but if you trace it back, really trace it back, you'll often find nothing. No origin, just repetition. You didn't choose it, you absorbed it. The paradox is this: we think we are the authors of our beliefs, that each one was carved through deliberation, choice, and personal experience. But the truth is quieter. We are often the inheritors of mental furniture placed long before we arrived, by culture, by media, by parents, by peers, by algorithms, and once placed, we treat these pieces as permanent. We decorate around them. We build our identities on top of them. The brain doesn't resist what it has heard enough times. It adopts. This is not a flaw. It's an efficiency, an evolutionary shortcut. We cannot question everything we hear. We cannot doubt every fragment of input. The mind would collapse under the weight of perpetual skepticism, so it takes in what repeats. It trusts what's familiar. It softens to the echo, but once you see this, really see it, something remarkable becomes possible. You can unchoose. You can notice the thoughts that never asked for permission and ask them to leave, not with violence, not with shame, but with awareness, with curiosity. You can trace the belief back to its echo and decide, do I want this in me? Some thoughts deserve to stay. Some truths once absorbed serve you, but others, those that were whispered too many times, those that arrived draped in repetition but void of clarity, those can be released. It begins not by fighting them, but by witnessing them, by sitting still long enough to feel which ideas actually resonate and which only feel right because they've repeated themselves into the folds of your attention. This awareness doesn't scream. It doesn't declare a revolution. It just notices. It notices the difference between a thought that emerged from reflection and one that crept in through familiarity. It notices that the loudest voice in your mind might not be your own. It notices that belief, when stripped of memory, often reveals its disguise. And in that noticing, something sacred opens. Space. Space to choose. Space to rewrite. Space to say softly, I don't believe this anymore. The thought may linger a while longer. It may echo again, but it will sound different now. Hollow, faint, you will recognize the shape of it, and in recognizing it, you will begin to reclaim your voice, because the thoughts that shape you are not fate. They are visitors, and you get to decide who stays. There are voices you don't remember hearing, not distinctly, not directly, yet somehow they've become the background noise in your inner world, reciting beliefs, judgments, quiet permissions, and prohibitions you've long mistaken for your own. You think you're the one thinking, but listen closely. The rhythm is yours. The inflection is not. This is the paradox of internal narration. The more familiar a thought becomes, the more we assume it is ours. But familiarity isn't authorship. Recognition isn't origin. And much of what we call our truth has, in fact, been borrowed, picked up in small pieces, softened by repetition, until it fits so comfortably in the mind it feels custom-made. You rarely question the tone of your thoughts. You rarely ask where the phrasing came from. why certain ideas sound a little more like your mother, or your teacher, or someone whose name you forgot, but whose approval still echoes across the years. Beliefs don't need proof to take root. They need pattern. And patterned speech, especially when heard often, becomes indistinguishable from self-talk. Take the voice that reminds you to be careful, to not speak up, to stay small. Maybe it sounds like caution. Maybe it sounds like shame. It might be narrated with concern or bitterness or polished authority. But was it really born inside you, or was it impressed upon you again and again until it wore a groove in your awareness, until your thoughts could mimic its shape without resistance? This is how suggestion works, not with argument but with echo. The mind learns to reproduce the cadence of what it hears most often, and what's heard most often is rarely chosen. It's absorbed in classrooms, on playgrounds, across dinner tables and glowing screens, in the quiet space after praise, in the silence that followed punishment. Language becomes belief. Belief becomes instinct. Instinct becomes identity. Not because it was earned, but because it was heard often enough to stop being questioned. Now you may say, but I think for myself. I decide what I believe, and that may be true sometimes. But when was the last time you paused, truly paused, to audit the origins of your convictions? Not the beliefs you arrived at deliberately, the ones that seem self-evident, the ones you've never had to explain because they've always just felt right. Those are the ones worth listening to. Not because they're wrong, but because they might not be yours. This is where the accent reveals itself, subtly. It's in the way a thought concludes before you finish reasoning, in the way you silently categorize someone at a glance, in the discomfort that arises when you consider changing your mind. These are traces, linguistic fingerprints of borrowed cognition. They're hard to catch, but they're there. You don't need to know exactly where the thought came from. You only need to recognize that it has an accent, that it speaks in a rhythm you didn't invent, that the phrases sound slightly rehearsed, slightly outside you, slightly scripted. And this recognition doesn't require shame. It requires stillness, because once you pause the internal monologue long enough to listen, to actually hear the structure of your thoughts, you begin to notice the architecture, how the sentences form, what words they prefer, what tone they carry. Some thoughts arrive like a question, others like a reprimand. Some sound like warning bells, others hum lullabies of avoidance. And in that observation, a strange realization emerges. Your mind has many voices, some inherited, some mimicked, some adopted out of necessity, out of survival, out of love. But not all were chosen, not all were helpful, and not all deserve the authority they've been granted. So you begin to ask, who am I quoting when I think this? Who benefits if I never question it? Whose story am I reenacting every time I tell myself I can't? And the answers, if you allow them to come, will likely be fragmented. A look you internalized, a phrase repeated in your household, a line from a film, a belief repeated by someone you wanted to please. Sometimes it's not a person but a culture, a system, a structure of expectation that whispered again and again until it became doctrine. There's nothing inherently malicious about this process. It's just what the mind does. It's adaptive. It echoes what surrounds it. The problem arises when the echo takes over, when the voice of the other becomes the voice of the self, and when that voice begins to tell you not who you are, but who you're allowed to be. Because every accent carries assumptions, every borrowed voice brings its own logic. Some are helpful, some are cruel, some are simply outdated. But if you never examine them, they all get equal airtime, equal influence, equal access to your choices. So what happens when you begin to notice the differences, when you start to separate the chorus from the core? First, things get quieter, not in the absence of thought, but in the easing of automatic agreement. You hear the old phrase, "Rise up, you're not good enough," but instead of repeating it, you tilt your head. Whose voice was that? You don't fight it. You don't try to overwrite it immediately. You just let it sit without believing it. You watch it echo. You let the accent stand out. And slowly its grip loosens. You may still hear it again tomorrow. It may return next week, but now it lands differently. Now it's just a sound, not a command, not a fact, just an echo that no longer fits in your throat. And from that space, your voice begins to form. It's quieter at first, less confident. It doesn't use grand declarations or perfect grammar, but it's yours. And as you speak it, tentatively, truthfully, it begins to fill the space the echo once claimed. It doesn't need to be certain. It doesn't need to be flawless. It only needs to be present. This is not a war between voices. It's a process of recognition, of reverence for your own inner cadence, of peeling away what was borrowed so you can uncover what's original. Because the mind is not a monologue, it's a chamber of overlapping frequencies, and the more you listen, the more you can tune them, not to silence the others, but to know which one is truly singing. So tonight, as your thoughts begin their nightly rituals, let them speak. Don't resist, don't interrupt. Just notice the ones that feel worn in, repeated, strangely confident, and then listen more closely. Do they carry an accent you recognize? Are they yours, or are they echoes that have lived in you long enough to sound like home? Not every echo deserves a microphone, and not every voice deserves your belief. Let your own rise now, not loudly, not forcefully, but patiently, word by word, sentence by sentence, until the script changes, until the voice feels like breath, until you begin to recognize yourself again, not as an echo, but as the origin. There are lies you never believed, not because you were too clever, but because they arrived with jagged edges, too obvious, too absurd, too crude to pass as truth. You turned them away at the door. But some lies, some were soft, some wore the scent of comfort. They came in gently, wrapped in the warm fabric of what you needed to hear, and you let them stay. Not because they convinced you, but because they consoled you. And consolation, for the mind, is sometimes more precious than truth. The lie you loved didn't declare itself. It didn't come with threat or force. It came disguised as reassurance. A calm whisper that told you were fine, that you didn't need to change, that everything made sense as it was. It soothed your confusion. It gave your discomfort a story. And that story was simple, digestible, familiar, the kind of fiction that doesn't shout but hums. You didn't love the lie because you were naive. You loved it because it offered rest. While truth demands discomfort, demands confrontation, reevaluation, disassembly, the lie allowed stillness, not the stillness of clarity, but the stillness of escape. The lie told you what you hoped was already true, that they were the problem, that the system works, that you've done all you can, that it was out of your hands, that your pain means something. Some lies sound suspicious, others sound like relief. The lie you loved didn't live at the surface of your mind. It moved deeper, into the background music of your explanations. It framed your memories, colored your sense of self. It whispered not only about the world, but about your place in it. You stopped noticing when it spoke. Eventually, it became the narrator, and when something contradicted it, when evidence suggested otherwise, it was not the lie that felt wrong. It was the truth. Because truth, when unfamiliar, feels alien, and the lie, when loved long enough, feels like home. It's easy to think of deception as something imposed, but the most lasting illusions are the ones we participate in, the ones we defend because they've defended us, the ones we cherish because we've built around them. Tear the lie down, and the house begins to tremble. So we keep it, we decorate it, we reinforce it with memories we've reshaped to fit the frame. Ask yourself, what do I believe that I've never dared to challenge? What idea do I protect not because it's true, but because of what would happen if it wasn't? The mind is not a vault. It is a narrative machine, and narratives don't require accuracy. They require emotional harmony. If the lie harmonizes with your grief, your longing, your loneliness, it becomes harder to resist. Not because it's hidden, but because it fits. And when it fits, we stop checking the label. This is why love is dangerous to truth, not because it corrupts, but because it blinds. We become attached not just to ideas, but to the roles they allow us to play. The lie might paint us as the hero, or the victim, or the martyr, or the misunderstood. These roles comfort us, explain us, shield us from ambiguity. Truth, by contrast, offers no guaranteed part. It may ask you to change, to let go, to unbecome. So we cling to the lie, not because we believe it, but because it believes in the version of us we're not ready to outgrow. Even when the cracks show, even when dissonance begins to buzz beneath the surface, we patch the illusion. We rationalize, we cherry-pick evidence, we mute the discomfort. We say, well, maybe it's not completely true, but it's close enough, or it's better than the alternative. And slowly we convince ourselves that the act of questioning is more dangerous than the lie itself. But deep down, the body remembers. It holds the tension. It stiffens when the truth is near. It flinches at contradictions. It aches when reality presses against the fiction too hard. And eventually, the ache becomes too constant to ignore. This is when the lie becomes a burden, when what once felt like protection now feels like weight. The story stops serving you. It starts limiting you. What was once a soothing narrative becomes a constraint. You begin to wonder, what if I let go? And the mind answers, then what will you hold? Because to release the lie is to lose more than a sentence. You lose the certainty it offered, the clarity, the identity. It's not just the illusion you're parting with, it's the person you were while believing it. And yet, this is the quiet liberation. When you allow the lie to leave, you don't collapse, you don't disappear, you remain. What's left is not the absence of belief, but the space for something truer to arrive, something you don't have to repeat in order to feel safe, something that may not be comforting, but is finally real. You won't stop loving the lie all at once. It may linger, it may return, It may call to you when you're tired or afraid or alone. But now you will recognize its voice, not as your truth, but as your history, not as your compass, but as a past that helped you survive when you didn't know how else to be. And slowly, gently, you will learn to love something else more. Not a new illusion, not another polished fiction, but the quiet honesty of not knowing, the tender strength of curiosity, the peace that arises not from having answers, but from no longer needing them to be comfortable. This is not the end of belief, it's the beginning of choice. And as you lie still, surrounded by your thoughts, feel them moving like clouds. Some are soft, some are heavy, some drift without name. You don't have to grab any of them. Just watch. And if one thought whispers, the old story again, you are this is all you'll ever be, smile gently. You know now, that thought is not truth. It was just the lie that was easier to love, and you don't need it anymore. There are beliefs stitched so deeply into you that you never noticed the threading, no moment of decision, no inner vote. They arrived before you were old enough to understand what belief was, passed on like hand-me-downs, not offered for acceptance but wrapped around you as the default. Not a question, but a given. These are the beliefs that entered before your defenses were formed, the kind that slipped through during childhood, through repetition, implication, or silence. They weren't explained, they weren't debated, they were simply present, like wallpaper, like air. This is how the world works. This is what people like us do. This is what matters. You didn't examine them, you embodied them. And now, years later, they shape the architecture of your perception. Not loudly, just persistently. You might never have agreed to them, but agreement was never asked. And this is the quiet paradox at the heart of belief. Not all that you believe is something you chose. We are taught to imagine belief as something we consciously construct, a thought scaffolded by reason, by evidence, by introspection. But many of your most persistent beliefs were inherited, not created. They were absorbed through tone, repetition, emotion. They live beneath your explanations, beneath your logic. They guide what feels right and wrong before you have a chance to think. This isn't a flaw in the mind, it's a feature. The brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, survival over precision. A belief repeated often in an emotionally charged context becomes a kind of shortcut. A bias dressed as instinct. And once that shortcut is wired in, challenging it feels unnatural, like rewriting muscle memory. You believe you're not creative not because you examined your potential and found it lacking, but because someone laughed when you drew something. You believe love must feel like sacrifice, not because you reasoned it through, but because that's what you watched growing up. You believe silence is strength, or that success means exhaustion, or that vulnerability is danger, and all of it arrived before you could say no. These beliefs were never framed as choices. They were cultural, familial, environmental, invisible in their delivery. You were simply placed inside them. And yet they shape everything. They shape how you interpret failure, how you respond to kindness, how you narrate your own life. They influence your decisions so seamlessly that you don't feel them as constraints. You feel them as truth, but there's a tension that builds over time, a subtle friction between the beliefs you've inherited and the experiences that contradict them. You achieve something that once felt impossible, but instead of joy, you feel guilt. You receive love without conditions, and part of you resists, suspicious. You speak up, and despite the relief, you wait for punishment. These are symptoms of unexamined beliefs pulling against your lived reality. When belief and experience collide, discomfort follows. And that discomfort is not proof that the new experience is wrong. It's often a sign that the old belief was never truly yours. It was simply louder for longer. There's power in noticing this, because once you see a belief for what it is, a repeated message, not a law, it begins to loosen. You don't need to rip it out. You don't need to argue with it. You only need to observe it with clarity. Trace it. Where did it come from? Who repeated it? Was it spoken or merely implied? Some beliefs arrived through fear, others through love. Some were mechanisms of control. Others were meant to protect you. But even protection, once outdated, becomes a prison. You were told not to cry so you wouldn't be mocked. But now you can't access your own grief. You were taught to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, but now you can't rest without guilt. The intention behind the belief doesn't make it permanent. It only makes it harder to question. But questioning is how you reclaim authorship. Ask, do I still want this belief shaping my life? Not, is it true in some abstract sense? But, is it useful? Is it kind? Is it mine? If the answer is no, you don't have to believe it just because it's been there for years. You are allowed to update the map. You are allowed to rebuild the framework. Belief is not a birthmark, it's a posture, and you can shift it. That shift doesn't happen all at once. You might still act out the old belief even after you've rejected it. That's normal. Neural patterns don't vanish with insight, but insight makes them visible, and visibility is the beginning of choice. This is where unlearning begins, not with erasure, but with awareness. You begin to see which beliefs were given to you before you had the strength to question. You begin to notice when you're living someone else's story, and slowly you start writing your own. You might still carry some old beliefs out of sentiment. Some you'll keep out of reverence. But now you're choosing. Now you're awake. And there's freedom in that. Freedom doesn't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it feels like a quiet breath after years of holding one in, like saying, I don't believe that anymore, and realizing the world didn't collapse. So tonight, as your thoughts settle and the noise of the day dissolves, listen for the beliefs that rise up uninvited, the ones that speak before you do, the ones that say you can't, that you shouldn't, that you must. Don't fight them. Don't prove them wrong. Just ask softly, who told me that? And did I ever agree? Because the belief that never asked for your consent never truly belonged to you. And now it doesn't have to stay. It was already there when you arrived. Not as a lesson or an argument, but as a tone, a background frequency humming through the walls of your early world. It didn't need to persuade you. It didn't ask for your reasoning. It simply existed, woven into stories, routines, glances exchanged across quiet rooms. You grew around it like roots around stone. This belief never introduced itself. You didn't choose it. You inherited it like the smell of a house or the shape of your posture. It arrived not in a single moment, but through accumulation, passed from hands that were also holding it, from voices repeating what had once been repeated to them. That's how it works. The most persistent beliefs don't present themselves as ideas to consider. They present themselves as reality. You wouldn't have known how to challenge it, even if you had tried. It sounded like common sense. It echoed from too many directions to trace. Maybe it told you something about what you're worth, or what love should cost, or what people like you are allowed to hope for. You didn't question it. You aligned with it like a body adjusting to gravity. And it worked, for a while. The belief offered a shape to follow, a guideline, a structure, but over time it hardened. What began as guidance turned into law. What once felt like safety began to constrict. You made choices around it, bent your behavior to it, explained your life through it, even when it hurt, even when it stopped making sense. Still, you called it yours, because that's what we do when something has been in us long enough. We confuse longevity with truth. We call it our voice, when it's really just the first one that echoed. But truth doesn't always speak first. Lies are often faster, simpler, easier to pass along, especially the ones coded in repetition, especially the ones that dress like facts. You were told, through words or silence, that certain doors weren't for you, that certain dreams were unrealistic, that speaking too loudly was rude, that asking for more meant you were ungrateful. You weren't told directly. It was in the way people reacted, in the way they praised quiet, rewarded compliance, frowned at uncertainty. You absorbed it without knowing. That's the trick. When belief is ambient, it doesn't feel like belief, it feels like environment. You lived inside it. You built identity around it. Not because you agreed, but because you were too young to know that disagreement was even possible. And now it's still here, still whispering, still informing your reactions, your habits, your resistance to things you secretly long for. When opportunity knocks, it answers first. That's not for you. When love arrives, it casts doubt. Be careful, they'll leave. When you rest, it reminds you, you haven't earned this yet. This belief doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be familiar. And the longer it's lived in you, the more it feels like instinct. But instinct isn't always inner wisdom. Sometimes it's conditioning with good posture. The question isn't whether the belief is true. The question is whether it serves you now. And often it doesn't. It keeps you small because it was born from someone else's fear. It keeps you silent because it was shaped in a time when safety meant not being seen. It keeps you compliant because it was planted in a system that rewards obedience over curiosity. But you are no longer the child who received it. You are no longer standing in the same room, listening to the same voices. You are here, breathing, thinking, capable of rewriting what was written in pencil but mistaken for stone. And it begins simply, with awareness, with noticing when the belief speaks before you do, when it makes decisions without consulting your present self, when it labels risk as recklessness and comfort as cowardice. You don't need to attack it. You don't need to disprove it in a single moment. You only need to ask, is this mine? And did I ever give it permission to stay? Some beliefs will wither the moment they're seen clearly. Others will linger. They've lived in you a long time. But now you're watching. Now you're separating the automatic from the authentic. And in that space, something new can grow. Not a counter-belief, not an opposite dogma, just a softer truth, one that emerges slowly, one that doesn't demand you change overnight, but invites you to question with kindness. Because the point is not to fill the gap the old belief leaves behind. It's to learn how to live without needing every gap to be filled. To trust that you can move through uncertainty without clinging to someone else's instructions. You are allowed to rewrite the script. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to let go of beliefs that were installed before you could say yes or no. This is not betrayal. This is self-authorship. And as you lie in the stillness of this moment, as your thoughts grow soft and your breath evens out, listen closely. If a thought speaks with the voice of certainty, ask where it learned that tone. Ask how long it's been rehearsing. Ask if you ever gave it permission to speak on your behalf. And then ask quietly, what else might be true? Let that question echo. Let it replace the answers that were never yours. And as sleep finds you, may it carry the sound of your own voice. Unforced, unborrowed, unfamiliar perhaps, but undeniably real. It didn't start seriously. It never does. Just a sentence said in passing, thrown into the air like a paper airplane. Something about you, your ability, your body, your dreams. Maybe they called it teasing. Maybe they swore they didn't mean it. Or maybe they did, but the laughter made it safe. That's how it landed. Not with cruelty, with humor. You laughed too, probably, or at least pretended to. Not because it was funny, but because reacting too seriously would have broken something. The mood, the balance, the role you were expected to play. And so, like most people in most rooms, you played along. You let the words settle instead of rising to meet them. What you didn't notice then, what none of us notice right away, is that the mind doesn't filter jokes from judgments, especially not when they're repeated, especially not when they come from someone whose approval you once needed, especially not when the joke carries the sharp edge of something they wouldn't say outright. Jokes are invitations, subtext in costume. They allow people to test ideas without responsibility, but the body remembers even when the context tries to excuse itself. You can forget what was said, but still carry its shape. You can forget the exact words, but still flinch when someone walks too close to that part of you. It's not about being fragile. It's about pattern. And the nervous system isn't built to decipher intention. It's built to survive what repeats. So you laugh, and the laughter becomes a seal. The joke passes, but something else stays. You begin to notice it again, subtle, then consistent. Little remarks, small digs, wounds hidden in irony. They always claim they're just joking, as if that erases the effect. But you start to shrink, a little each time. You become hesitant in the areas they tease you for. You stop drawing, or you stop speaking up, or you start assuming failure before you've even begun. The paradox is this: something not meant to be taken seriously becomes a belief more durable than most, because it was disguised, because you let your guard down, because you were expected to smile while it landed. And belief formed in laughter is harder to confront. It comes without warning. It blends in with the good moments. You remember the party, not the insult, the affection, not the sting, but the imprint is there, just beneath your confidence, waiting. You might even repeat the joke yourself, about you. You might say it casually, dismissively, so no one else has the chance to use it first. You get ahead of the pain by turning it into performance. But what begins as self-deprecation ends as self-definition. Over time, the joke becomes truth, not because it was true, but because it was rehearsed. And still, you won't call it a wound. You'll call it realism. You'll say, "Well, I've always been like this," or "It's not that deep." But something in you knows better. Something in you remembers what it felt like before the joke was made. And this is where the belief gets its power. You don't defend it with evidence. You defend it with history, with tone, with the way it was delivered, as if the lack of cruelty in the delivery means it couldn't have carved into anything. But it did. Because words shape reality, even when dressed as comedy, especially when repeated by people close enough to leave an impression, especially when said at the exact moment you were still forming an idea of who you are. It isn't about blame. Most people don't know the weight their words carry. They've inherited the same patterns. They've been told that teasing is affection, that sarcasm builds resilience. And so the cycle repeats. Laugh, jab, forget, laugh, jab, forget, until someone doesn't. Until someone, years later, finds themselves hesitating at the threshold of something beautiful and doesn't know why. Until someone freezes before expressing joy and assumes they're being ridiculous. Until someone believes, without evidence, that their work will be mocked, and if they trace it back, if they get quiet enough, they might hear the voice again. Not loud, not malicious, just amused. And underneath the amusement, a message. Don't take yourself too seriously. Don't believe you're good at this. Don't reach too far. All wrapped in a smile. But here's the thing. You can pull the joke out by its root. Not by fighting it, but by facing it. You don't have to confront the person who said it. That's not always possible. Sometimes the person's long gone. Sometimes they were you. What matters is that you stop laughing on cue, that you stop performing disbelief in yourself for the sake of keeping things light, that you pause the joke long enough to hear what it's actually doing. Because somewhere beneath the performance is something real, something fragile and alive. A dream, maybe, a voice you once trusted, a part of you that doesn't want to be ironic, that just wants to try, to believe, to express without parody. That part deserves air. You don't need to turn the joke into a trauma. You only need to acknowledge that it shaped something, that it planted something, and now you get to decide whether to water it. Not all humor has to be cautionary. Humor can heal too, but only if it points toward truth, not away from it. Only if it releases rather than restricts. Only if you're the one holding the mic, not hiding behind it. So tonight, as the mind unwinds and old thoughts make their quiet rounds, listen for the jokes, the ones you tell about yourself, the ones you've heard too many times, the ones that seem harmless but leave a mark. Ask, what belief lives under this laughter? And then, do I still think it's funny? Because maybe the time has come to stop joking about what you want to become. Maybe the belief you've hidden behind a punchline is the very thing you're meant to reclaim. And maybe, just maybe, your next laugh will come from truth, not protection. There are moments you remember with perfect clarity until you look closer and realize they never quite happened that way. Or maybe they didn't happen at all, but the emotion is there. The detail, the physical ache, a memory so sharp it leaves a scar. And yet, when you trace it back, the evidence is missing. You find gaps, inconsistencies, something slightly off, like a photograph with shadows that fall the wrong way. You try to dismiss it. If it didn't happen, it shouldn't matter. But the pain doesn't disappear, because the body doesn't require truth to feel. It only requires a pattern. And once that pattern's in place, once an idea repeats enough times, it becomes a kind of internal history, carved not in facts, but in emotional residue. This is the paradox. Memory can hurt you even when it lies. And some of the memories you carry most tightly are not records of events, but reflections of belief. They weren't born from what occurred. They were constructed from what you feared, what you felt, what you were told. You remember being ignored, though no one said the words. You remember being too much, too loud, too emotional, even if no one told you directly. You remember failing before you tried. You remember moments of rejection that existed more in the space between than in the space itself. The mind fills in blanks. It creates continuity where there is fragmentation. It stitches story from suggestion. If you were consistently treated with indifference, your mind might write a scene where someone says you don't matter, not because it happened, but because it explains what you felt. And that explanation sticks. Your memory isn't a hard drive, it's a narrative engine. And it doesn't prioritize accuracy. It prioritizes coherence. It wants to make emotional sense. It wants to match the internal world with a frame that justifies it. So it constructs, it edits, it misremembers. And then it convinces you the reconstruction is real. That memory of humiliation in class, you can picture the faces, the heat in your skin, the sound of the silence. But maybe no one laughed. Maybe no one even noticed. Maybe the embarrassment lived only inside you. But it doesn't matter. The body recorded it anyway. You still flinch when you're asked to speak. You still expect shame when you're visible. You still carry the memory, even if the moment never unfolded like that. This isn't weakness, it's wiring. Emotional memory is designed to keep you safe. If something hurt, even vaguely, it becomes a warning. The next time something similar appears, your system flares up. Be careful. This feels familiar, and that warning is mistaken for prediction. It will happen again. The original moment may never have happened as your mind tells it, but the belief that came from it is now real. You respond to it, you act on it, you use it to justify withdrawal, hesitation, self-doubt. And then the cycle begins. You avoid the thing you fear. You don't speak, you don't show up, you don't risk, and your mind says, "See, it's good you didn't. You would have failed. You would have been mocked." The belief reinforces the memory, and the memory reinforces the belief, and all of it lives in you, not because it's factual, but because it was felt. There's nothing shameful in this. It's how we survive early uncertainty, by turning emotions into maps. But what once protected you can now trap you. You find yourself reacting to things that aren't happening. You find yourself avoiding places that were never dangerous. You find yourself haunted by echoes of scenes that never played. And you wonder why you can't move forward. You don't need to dig through every memory to fix this. You don't need perfect clarity. You only need curiosity. When pain arises, when resistance flares, pause and ask, what am I remembering right now? What story am I replaying beneath the surface? And do I know it happened? Or do I just feel like it did? The difference matters, because once you identify a memory as emotional rather than factual, you can loosen your grip. You can stop treating it like prophecy. You can respond to the feeling without reinforcing the fiction. And sometimes the fiction needs compassion, not correction. You don't need to argue with the past. You need to comfort the part of you that felt abandoned, the child who absorbed shame, the teenager who feared being seen, the adult who rehearsed rejection before the world ever gave it. That part of you doesn't need a fact check. It needs gentleness. Tell it, I see you. I know you're hurting. I know something felt true even if it wasn't real, and I'm here now. Memory isn't the enemy, it's a mirror, and sometimes it reflects the shape of a wound, not the light that made it. You can hold that reflection without letting it define you. You can say, yes, this feels real, but maybe it's not the full story. And then you breathe. You notice the present. You look around and see if the danger is actually here, if the people in the room are really the ones from your past, if the shame belongs to this moment or to a version of you still carrying someone else's belief. And more often than not, you'll find that you're safe now. Not immune, not untouchable, but safe enough to question what you once accepted as truth. So tonight, if a memory rises that aches more than it should, don't push it away. Let it speak. Let it unfold. Then gently ask it, are you remembering pain or imagining it again? And either way, remind yourself, you are not obligated to believe every thought that visits, especially the ones that came dressed as memory. Certainty is a comfort we often wear like armor, a feeling of knowing, solid and unshakable. It grants stability, protects us from ambiguity, gives form to chaos. But not all certainty is earned. Some of it is borrowed, adopted from voices louder than our own, repeated often enough that questioning them feels like betrayal. And this is where the paradox lies. We may be most certain about things we never truly examined. You think you're sure, that you know what's right, what's wrong, what's possible, what's worth fearing. But stop and trace the source. Where did that surety begin? Was it built through reflection, through friction, through lived experience? Or did it arrive wrapped in someone else's tone, confident, authoritative, familiar? So much of what we claim to know begins as repetition. Repetition is powerful. The mind does not measure truth in evidence alone, it measures it in frequency. A belief repeated enough times begins to feel like knowledge, and once it feels like knowledge, it's rarely questioned. You might be certain that you're not talented, that you always ruin good things, that people don't really stay, that money is hard to hold, that you'll never escape the cycle. You might feel these things as truth, but listen closely. Whose voice are you echoing? Maybe it was a parent, a teacher, a partner, a collective narrative. Maybe it wasn't even spoken directly. Maybe it was the tone, the timing, the expression on their face when you tried. Certainty doesn't require clarity, only repetition. And you've heard it enough that now you speak it fluently. The strangest part is that you rarely notice it, because borrowed certainty feels the same in the body as discovered truth. It settles into your speech. It lives in your choices. You avoid what contradicts it. You shape your reality to match it. And all the while, it claims ownership of your voice. You may even defend it, argue for it. You'll call it being realistic, being logical, being honest. But what you're really doing is protecting the framework, not because it's accurate, but because it's been yours for so long that imagining life without it feels destabilizing. Borrowed certainty doesn't just live in personal beliefs, it lives in the cultural scripts we carry. What we believe about success, about failure, about gender, about love, about what a good life looks like. These ideas arrive not as options, but as norms, and deviating from them feels dangerous, not because they're true, but because they're embedded. So the question becomes, what am I sure of that I've never chosen for myself? This isn't an invitation to reject everything. It's an invitation to re-enter your own beliefs as a participant, not a passenger. To ask whether your certainty is based on your lived experience, or someone else's fear, someone else's preference, someone else's pain. And here's the strange part. Once you begin to examine certainty, it softens, not because it becomes invalid, but because it loses its need to dominate. Truth doesn't require shouting. Only insecurity does. Once you're grounded in your own truth, you don't need to defend it with edge. You don't need to convert others. You're no longer trying to silence the voice of doubt. You've made peace with it. Doubt isn't the enemy of belief, it's the refining tool, the scalpel that reveals what's real and what's residue. When you allow doubt into the room, not to take over, but to test, you create space for clarity. You stop clinging to beliefs just because they've kept you company the longest. And in that space, something new can emerge. Not a louder belief, not a different borrowed voice, but a quieter knowing, one that hums rather than shouts, one that survives contradiction, one that adapts. This is the voice of lived truth, of self-understanding. It's slower to arrive. It doesn't come from repetition. It comes from resonance. You recognize it not by how often you've heard it, but by how deeply it aligns with your experience. It won't always offer certainty. Sometimes it just offers direction, and that's enough. That's the kind of knowing that doesn't collapse under pressure. Because it's been questioned, it's been tested. It has earned its place in you. So tonight, let yourself notice the places where your certainty feels rigid, where it shows up as a boundary you didn't draw, where it resists being examined. Ask, who taught me this certainty? And what were they afraid would happen if I didn't believe it? And then ask, am I ready to believe something else? You don't have to answer right away. You don't need a new certainty to replace the old. What you need is honesty, the willingness to admit that some of what you're sure of was never truly yours. That's not failure, that's freedom. Because once you stop mistaking volume for truth, you can begin to hear yourself again. And your voice, uncertain, evolving, unpolished, is more real than any borrowed conviction ever was. Sometimes you feel something deeply and don't know why. An opinion so strong it resists challenge, a judgment that rises instantly, a reaction that flares without warning. It feels like truth, solid, self-evident, beyond doubt. You brace yourself in it. You speak from it, you act through it. And yet, when you pause to investigate, to trace it back to its origin, it disappears into fog. There's no memory, no first moment, no event you can point to. Just the conviction, standing there fully formed, as if it emerged from nowhere. But belief never comes from nowhere. It always comes from somewhere. And when you can't find the source, it usually means the belief was shaped slowly, indirectly, Beneath awareness, a quiet accumulation of impressions, a drip of subtle cues, looks, symbols, moods, stories, a repetition too soft to register as instruction, but persistent enough to settle into shape. This is the paradox of conviction. The strength with which we believe something often has no correlation to how carefully we've thought about it. You may be utterly convinced that vulnerability is weakness, that success looks a certain way, that people always leave, that you're not creative, that things never change. You may believe these things with confidence, but ask yourself to provide the foundation, the reasoning, the clear thread back to the beginning, and what you'll find is smoke. Because the strongest convictions are often not the ones we arrived at. They are the ones we inherited, beliefs we absorbed before we had the language to resist them. Convictions installed by culture, by systems, by those whose voices were loudest when we were quietest. And the mind, once shaped, defends itself. It doesn't wait for inquiry. It protects its patterns. A conviction, once wired into your sense of identity, becomes automatic. You don't question it, because questioning it would mean questioning yourself. And so the belief sits at the center, untouched, while the rest of your thoughts orbit around it. But eventually, something feels off. A contradiction arises. You meet someone who proves the belief false. You succeed at something you were certain you couldn't. You love without the disaster you were told would follow, and the conviction trembles just slightly. A crack forms. You might ignore it at first, chalk it up to luck, to anomaly. But the crack is there now. The story no longer fits seamlessly around your life. And that's when discomfort sets in, because the belief no longer protects, it confines. And yet you don't know how to let go. You don't know what would be left without it. Letting go of a conviction without a source is like removing a load-bearing wall in a house you didn't build. You don't know what will fall. So you hesitate. You keep carrying it. Not because it makes sense, but because it's familiar, because you've aligned your identity with it. But you are not your beliefs. You are the space in which belief happens. The witness, the architect, the reviser. Beliefs are meant to be fluid, evolving, subject to evidence, experience, time. Conviction becomes dangerous when it hardens into permanence, when it begins to resist the very world it's supposed to help interpret. The brain loves certainty. It finds comfort in absolutes. But certainty without examination is just rigidity. And rigidity is not clarity. It's fear pretending to be knowledge. So what happens when you finally decide to question? It begins slowly. You take a belief you've always held, maybe one about your worth, your limits, your place in the world, and you ask, when did I start believing this? Who told me? Why did I listen? And does it still serve me now? You won't always get a clear answer. Sometimes the belief came from everywhere and nowhere, a cultural mist that soaked into your skin. But even noticing that opens a crack. Even realizing I don't actually know where this came from is enough to shift it, to create space, to soften the walls around your assumptions. And in that space, something remarkable can happen. You can begin to imagine alternatives. Maybe vulnerability is strength. Maybe rest is not laziness. Maybe love isn't transactional. Maybe your value isn't tied to productivity. These may sound simple, but to a mind built on opposite convictions, they are revolutions. They reorient everything. This process isn't about rejecting all your beliefs. It's about choosing which ones deserve to stay, which ones you want to live by, which ones you want to teach, repeat, embody. Because beliefs don't just shape your thoughts. They shape your behavior, your attention, your relationships. They become the language of your life. To revise your convictions is to rewrite the script you perform daily, not because you were wrong, but because you're growing. And growth requires flexibility. So tonight, in the quiet that follows your thoughts, notice what you feel strongly about, what rises first, what feels absolute. And instead of agreeing automatically, pause, tilt your head. Ask, where did this come from? Who did I learn it from? Did I ever truly choose it? You don't need to find the source to let go. You only need to recognize that a missing origin doesn't make something more real. It often means the opposite. The more invisible the root, the more accidental the growth. And you are allowed to uproot what no longer serves you. Because conviction without awareness is just inertia, and belief without choice is just repetition. Some beliefs arrive like stories carefully told. Others arrive like instructions backed by consequences. But some don't arrive at all. They're already there, like dust settling before you ever noticed the light. They embed before you learn to ask questions. They lodge in the space between exposure and understanding. These are the beliefs that never knocked. They didn't need to. The door was never closed. You inherit them in the pauses of conversation, in the tension around certain topics, in the rules no one explains but everyone follows. A glance, a wince, a shrug repeated often enough, a sigh attached to a name. These aren't ideas you agree with, they're environments you adapt to. And slowly, that adaptation becomes a worldview. You never decided to believe that softness is weakness, or that money is morality, or that love should hurt. But if you grew up inside those patterns, if you witnessed them more than once, if no one ever contradicted them, they took root. Not because you examined them, because you didn't know you could. This is the quiet paradox. The beliefs you never consented to often shape you more than the ones you chose. You may find yourself avoiding conflict without knowing why. You may undercharge for your work, apologize for taking up space, distrust joy, sabotage ease. And when someone asks where it started, you won't have a story, just a feeling, a hunch, a posture you've always assumed. You call it personality, you call it realism, but it's not that. It's exposure, calcified. And once it's there, it starts to write your script. You hesitate before speaking. You turn down opportunity. You expect to be left. You treat rest like guilt. You wait for the catch. You expect the apology to never come. And all of it feels like wisdom. But it isn't. It's memory acting as a compass, even when the coordinates no longer fit. The thing is, unchosen beliefs rarely announce themselves. They blend. They mimic instinct. They pass for caution. You don't even know they're there until they're threatened. Someone loves you gently, and your body flinches. Someone trusts you, and you search for their motive. Something works out, and your nervous system scans for what must go wrong next. You think you're being careful, but what you're actually doing is defending the pattern. The belief embedded so early that safety means maintaining it, and safety, even when painful, is addictive. So how do you notice what never asked to be noticed? You start with resistance. The moment you pull away without cause, the instinct to say no to what you want, the unease that follows kindness, these are signals, indicators that something is being protected, but not necessarily something true. Something familiar, something learned. And once you see it, you can begin to unlearn, not with force, not with shame, but with permission. Permission to question, to disagree, to detach. You ask, did I choose this belief, or did it choose me? Do I live by it because it's real, or because it's old? Do I still want it? Some beliefs will fall away quietly, like dust brushed from the edge of your awareness. Others will cling. They'll argue. They'll present themselves as identity, as loyalty, as legacy. And that's when it gets harder. Because some beliefs came from people you loved, people you needed to survive. To reject the belief can feel like rejecting them, like rewriting the story of your own belonging. But growth isn't betrayal. It's continuity. You're not erasing what came before. You're evolving it. You can honor where it came from without letting it own your future. You can grieve the parts that no longer fit. You can thank the patterns that kept you safe and still decide not to follow them anymore. That's the real permission. To be loyal to truth, not just tradition. To be guided by alignment, not just inheritance. To believe with clarity and kindness that you are allowed to choose again. So tonight, in the quiet space between thought and sleep, ask softly, what part of me is living by someone else's rule book? What belief have I never questioned? Not because it's sacred, but because it came too early to doubt. And then breathe, because you are not obligated to carry every rule you were raised inside. You are not beholden to every pattern that feels familiar. You are not responsible for upholding beliefs you never agreed to. You are responsible only for awareness, for gentleness, for the gradual, quiet, radical work of choosing again. And you can begin now, not by changing everything, but by noticing what was never yours to keep. You hear it enough times, and it starts to feel true, not because you've thought it through, not because you've tested it, but because others seem to agree. The nods, the repetition, the silence that follows. Agreement has a rhythm that feels like confirmation. And slowly, that confirmation settles into the bones of your belief. You say something half certain, I'm not good at that, people can't be trusted, I'll probably fail, and someone nods, or doesn't argue, or offers a story that mirrors your own. And now the idea has legs, it can stand upright. Not because it's been proven, but because someone else didn't push back. Agreement, repeated, becomes a kind of evidence. It gives shape to assumptions. It lets you file your doubts away as resolved. And the more people who echo it, the stronger it becomes. Not in logic, but in volume, in familiarity, in collective inertia. But here's the paradox. We confuse agreement with reality. We take consensus as truth. We trust the crowd, the algorithm, the room, the cultural hum that tells us what's normal, what's acceptable, what's off limits. And in doing so, we outsource our sense of what's real. You believe you're too sensitive because others said it too. You believe you talk too much because the room always goes quiet when you speak. You believe your dreams are unrealistic because they made someone else uncomfortable. None of this is proof, it's pattern, it's resonance mistaken for fact. And resonance can be dangerous when unexamined, not because it's always wrong, but because it's too easy, too smooth. It bypasses friction. And friction is where thinking happens. It's natural to want validation. We're wired for it. In early life, survival depends on attunement. Belonging isn't a preference, it's a biological imperative. So we learn to scan the group. We watch the faces, we adjust. We absorb what keeps us safe. And we carry that skill into adulthood, where it becomes a filter. You speak carefully, looking for approval. You test ideas with disclaimers. You shrink your expression to match the room. And when the group nods, you feel secure, not just socially but philosophically. It feels like alignment, but sometimes it's just conformity in disguise. Agreement doesn't require depth, it requires comfort. People agree with what feels familiar, not necessarily what's true. And if everyone around you shares the same unexamined belief, that belief calcifies. You stop thinking of it as a belief. You start calling it reality. And this is how illusions spread. Not through lies, but through repetition. Through conversations where no one asks, "Is that really true?" Or just common. Look closer. What do you believe simply because no one around you has challenged it? That your value comes from achievement? That struggle is proof of virtue? That success must look like scarcity or sacrifice? These ideas aren't facts. They're echoes, repeated until they pass as architecture. And the danger is not that they're wrong, it's that you stop asking. But something in you remembers the question, something quiet, something slow. It rises when you're alone, when the crowd is gone, when your thoughts no longer need to impress. It wonders, what if everyone is wrong? What if the agreement isn't proof, just shared fear? It's a lonely thought, to stand apart from consensus, to say, "This doesn't feel right," when everyone else is nodding. But that's where truth begins, not in comfort, but in curiosity, in the willingness to let silence follow your doubt. You don't have to argue. You don't have to convince. You only have to pause. That pause is powerful. It disrupts the rhythm. It creates a space where truth has room to speak. Truth that may contradict the group, the tradition, the role you've been asked to play. You're not being difficult, you're being honest, and honesty doesn't always nod along. So how do you know what you truly believe? You begin by noticing when agreement feels too easy, when you're saying yes without thinking, when you feel reassured not because you understand, but because you've heard it before. Ask, am I agreeing or am I avoiding discomfort? Then go deeper. If no one else believed this, would I still hold it? If I had to explain this to someone who had never heard it, could I? If the belief crumbles under that weight, maybe it was never yours. Maybe it was borrowed, rehearsed, rewarded, but not rooted. And that's okay. Letting go of a belief doesn't make you lost. It makes you lighter. It frees up space to learn again. Not from habit, but from experience, from evidence, from the quiet voice inside you that doesn't shout, but persists. It's not about isolation. It's not about rejecting community. It's about refining your filters, choosing whose agreement matters, whose silence speaks truth, whose voice resonates not out of fear or loyalty, but out of lived alignment. Agreement can be beautiful when it's real, when it's earned, when it's the product of parallel seeking, not shared stagnation. But unearned agreement is flattery at best, indoctrination at worst. It keeps you comfortable, but small. So tonight, as you lie in that liminal space between waking and dream, listen for what you've accepted without inquiry, for the beliefs that feel supported only because others nod. Ask, is this something I believe when I'm alone, or only when I'm trying to belong? Because belonging built on agreement is fragile, but belief built in solitude, that endures. Silence isn't neutral, it speaks, sometimes louder than words, sometimes with more lasting effect. You remember what was said, of course, but often what stays with you longer are the things no one ever said, the gaps, the absences, the questions you didn't ask, because no one else seemed to need answers. And so much of what you believe was shaped not by direct teaching, but by implication. You weren't told you were too much, but no one celebrated when you were fully yourself. You weren't told to suppress your sadness, but no one held you when you cried. You weren't told dreams were dangerous, but no one asked you what you hoped for either. In that silence, a lesson forms. It's not conscious, it's subtle, persistent, invisible until it calcifies. You fill in the blanks. If no one mentioned it, maybe it wasn't important. If they avoided it, maybe it was shameful. If no one ever modeled it, maybe it's not for people like me. And slowly, that quiet morphs into belief. This is the paradox. What is absent becomes presence. What is unspoken becomes script. You don't need to be told what to fear, what to hide, what to sacrifice. You'll learn it from the empty spaces where love should have clarified, where encouragement should have interrupted, where curiosity should have cracked open possibility. These gaps become guidelines. You stop asking for what you never saw others receive. You stop imagining paths that were never pointed out. You preempt rejection that was never stated but always suggested. You shrink to fit the silence. And that silence becomes an inheritance, passed not through words but through discomfort, through the hesitations you learn to read between breaths, through the stories people never told about themselves, through the way they changed the subject when things got too vivid, too alive, too raw. You believed without instruction that some parts of you weren't welcome, and so you buried them. Not because they were wrong, but because they weren't mirrored. They weren't reflected back. And the human mind, built on connection, needs reflection to feel real. Without it, even truth begins to feel like a mistake. And that's the strange, quiet ache that comes later in life. You realize you've built an entire personality around avoidance, around things that were never actually forbidden, but also never given air. And now, when the opportunity appears, when someone asks you what you want, how you feel, who you are, you struggle to answer, because no one ever asked before. And part of you assumed that meant you shouldn't. The world doesn't only mold us through action, it molds us through neglect. And neglect, while often unintentional, still shapes. It still leaves gaps where possibility could have bloomed. You believed you weren't interesting, not because someone said it, but because they never leaned in. You believed your voice didn't matter, not because it was silenced, but because no one paused to listen. And now, you pause yourself, you censor in anticipation, you downplay before anyone reacts, you feel the limits that were never articulated, and you enforce them yourself. You become the echo of silence, carrying it forward as if it were guidance. But it wasn't guidance, it was absence, and you are allowed to name it as such. not to blame, but to understand. Because naming is the beginning of healing. You can say, "No one ever told me I was allowed to feel that. No one ever taught me that I was worth noticing. No one ever showed me how to take up space without apology." And in that naming, you reclaim the power to choose differently. You don't need to inherit silence. You can interrupt it. You can speak where no one else did. You can ask the questions you were taught not to ask. Not with defiance, but with reverence for what might grow in the space that follows. Because here's the quiet power in all of this. What wasn't said can be said now. What wasn't modeled can be chosen. You can become the person who makes space for the things others avoided, for the feelings others suppressed, for the desires others shamed in themselves and in you. You don't need a perfect example to become your own. You don't need permission that never came. You only need awareness. You notice the belief, "This part of me is too much," and instead of obeying it, you sit with it. You hold it like a relic. You ask it gently, "Who left you here? Who couldn't hold you? Who looked away?" And the answers won't always be cruel. Sometimes the silence came from people who were silenced themselves, who never got to be whole, who never received the reflection they needed either. And so, the silence passed on, inherited like a wound, worn like a second skin. You don't have to carry it further. You can love those people, honor them, and still say, "This ends with me," because silence doesn't need to be broken with volume. It can be broken with presence, with one real sentence, one admission, one expression that once would have felt forbidden. You are allowed to feel what wasn't acknowledged. You are allowed to want what was never offered. You are allowed to speak into the spaces that scared you before. And if your voice trembles, that's okay. Trembling is truth trying to surface through old stillness. Let it shake, let it stumble, let it say what was never said to you. You're allowed to be whole, even here, even now. So as you settle into stillness tonight, as the day dissolves and your mind drifts inward, listen for the spaces, not the loud beliefs, but the quiet ones, the ones you learned by accident, the ones shaped by omission, the ones that say, "Don't go there, don't ask that, don't be that." And then ask, softly, "Why not?" Then listen for the answer, not from the past, from yourself. You are allowed to fill the silence, and what you say now can become someone else's first echo of freedom. Not all lies arrive to deceive. Some arrive to soothe. Some are wrapped in kindness, told by people who meant well. Others aren't spoken at all, but implied, gently, repeatedly, until they become a part of how you describe yourself. You're so responsible. You're always the calm one. You're the strong one, the smart one, the one who never complains. You internalized these soft affirmations not as roles to play, but as definitions of who you are. And over time, they became your compass. You adjusted to them, lived up to them, held them carefully because to drop them would feel like disappointing someone. To contradict them would be to lose a kind of value tied not to being, but to performance. So you stayed composed when you needed comfort. You stayed agreeable when you wanted to scream. You helped everyone else before asking for help yourself. You did it so often, so seamlessly, that you forgot it was a choice. You believed that was just who you were. But here's the paradox. The identities that earn us the most praise are often the hardest to let go of. even when they hurt us. You begin to confuse effort with essence. You think being strong means never cracking. You think being kind means always saying yes. You think being successful means never resting. These aren't lies in the way we usually imagine them. They're not malicious, they're not shouted, they're soft, but they still bind. Because when you mistake them for identity, you stop allowing contradiction. And without contradiction, you lose flexibility. You become a character, a version of yourself that performs well under pressure, that always knows the right thing to say, that never inconveniences, never disappoints, never fails, and you're applauded for it. You're admired. But you're tired. You're tired because somewhere beneath the applause is a locked room filled with parts of you you haven't allowed to speak. The needy parts, the jealous parts, the ones that cry over things no one else understands. The ones that don't want to be wise or mature or useful. The parts that just want to be without expectation. And it's not that you've lied to others. It's that you've mistaken adaptation for authenticity. You did what was needed. You learned the rules. You played the part. And for a while, it worked. It helped you survive. It gave you identity in a world that demanded clarity. But now it confines you. Now it won't let you rest. It won't let you rage. It won't let you grow. Because to grow, you'd have to change. And to change, you'd have to let go of what once defined you. That's terrifying. Even if the role is painful, it's still familiar. It's still safe. You know how to be the one who fixes things, the one who forgives first, the one who never asks for more. And if you stopped being that person, what would happen? Would people leave? Would you still be loved? That's the secret fear soft lies carry, that your worth is conditional, that who you are is only acceptable when filtered through the role others found most useful. But that isn't love, that's utility. And you deserve more than that. You deserve to be whole, not just useful, not just consistent, not just agreeable. You deserve to be messy, changing, contradictory, alive. And the first step toward that is noticing which parts of your identity were constructed from praise. Ask, when did I first start believing I had to be this way to be valued? Who benefits from me always being strong, calm, patient? What part of me have I silenced to maintain this image? These are hard questions, but they open the door to something softer, something truer. You don't need to destroy your old self. You only need to give the rest of you room to emerge. Slowly, without apology. You might still be kind, still be strong, still be dependable. But now, those qualities won't define you. They'll just describe you. Sometimes, when it's true, when it's chosen, and on other days, you'll be tired, you'll be selfish, you'll be loud, you'll say no, you'll ask for help, you'll change your mind, and none of it will make you less real. Because the truth is, identity is not meant to be static. It's not a brand. It's not a product. It's not a promise you owe the world. It's a spectrum, a weather system, a shifting expression of inner movement. You are not here to live up to a story. You're here to live. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, listen for the roles you've taken on. The ones you didn't pick, but kept because they kept the peace. Hear them speak. Hear them whisper the rules you never questioned. Be good. Be small. Be useful. Be quiet. Be grateful. And then say softly, I can be more than that. Say it again, not as rebellion, but as invitation. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to disappoint. You are allowed to not always live up to the version of you others liked best. Because the soft lies that once held you together don't need to hold you anymore. Now you get to hold yourself. All of you, even the parts no one clapped for. Repetition feels like truth. That's the trick. The more you hear something, whether it's a phrase, an assumption, a casual remark, the more familiar it becomes. And familiarity to the subconscious reads as safety. Safety becomes comfort. Comfort becomes credibility. And soon, without even realizing it, you start believing not because something made sense, but because it showed up often enough. You repeat it to yourself in quiet moments. You hear it echoed in the words of others. You spot it in headlines, in lyrics, in the tone of conversations you weren't even a part of. The phrase is always there, like a hallway light left on. You're too sensitive. You'll never keep up. This is just how things are. People like you don't get that far. And with each repetition, the idea gets smoother, easier to say, easier to accept. You don't remember when you started believing it. That's the strangest part. The belief didn't arrive in a single moment. It crept in sideways, absorbed through osmosis. You were exposed to it when you were too young to object, too uncertain to challenge, too eager to belong. And here's the paradox. Beliefs repeated enough times don't need evidence. They don't need logic. They don't even need a speaker. They just need presence. The mind registers the pattern, and the pattern becomes identity. The belief takes root not because it was convincing, but because it was consistent. And you didn't just believe the words. You believed the tone, the timing, the mood it always carried. Maybe the phrase was sarcastic. Maybe it came with a smile that didn't match the meaning. Maybe it was said in the moment when you were most open, most raw, most wanting to be accepted. That's when it sinks the deepest. Because repetition is never neutral. It's directional. It's strategic. It doesn't land the same way in everyone. It shapes itself to your vulnerabilities, to your needs. The belief knows what you long to hear, and also what you fear. It weaves both into its rhythm. You start building around it. Not explicitly, not consciously, but quietly. You make decisions that align with it. You avoid risks that might contradict it. You prepare for outcomes it told you were inevitable. You stop considering options that fall outside its range, and what began as exposure becomes enclosure. A wall, a script, a narrowing of who you're allowed to be. But if you look closely behind the repetition, there's a face. Not literally, symbolically, an origin, a source, a first voice, a context. And when you ask, who first said this to me? Where did this belief get its tone? The answer often surprises you. It wasn't a villain. It wasn't a stranger. It might have been someone you loved, someone you trusted, someone who was repeating what had been said to them, someone who didn't even realize the gravity of their words, someone who mistook opinion for truth. And they said it once, or twice, or every time you showed that part of yourself. And even if they forgot, you didn't. You carried it forward, echoed it inward, until the voice sounded like your own. But it never really was. That's the painful revelation. That the beliefs you recite to yourself, the ones that sting, the ones that limit, the ones that predict failure or shame, were never yours to begin with. You've just been rehearsing someone else's script, perfectly, faithfully, for years. And now you can choose to stop, not by force, not by erasing what's been written, but by becoming curious, by pulling the phrase into the light, by asking it to explain itself. Because beliefs can't stand up to scrutiny when they have no spine. They collapse when asked why. Ask it, why do you keep saying that? Where did you learn it? Who first gave it to you? And do I actually agree? At first, the belief might resist. It might disguise itself as instinct. It might dress up as realism. But the more questions you ask, the clearer the cracks become. The voice starts to sound less like yours. The tone mismatches. The rhythm falters. That's the moment the spell breaks. Repetition loses power when it's interrupted. And interruption doesn't require shouting. It only requires stillness, attention, the quiet courage to say, wait, just because I've always heard this doesn't mean I have to believe it now. You can replace the rhythm. You can choose a new phrase, something true, not perfect, not performative, just real. Something that feels clumsy at first, maybe even unconvincing. But say it anyway, say it again, let it echo. Not because it's easy, but because you're ready to learn a new song. Something like, I'm allowed to grow. My voice matters. What I want is valid. Not everything repeated deserves my belief. Say it softly. Say it with breath. Say it until the words stop sounding strange, until the rhythm becomes yours. Repetition got you here. Repetition can get you out. So tonight, as the noise softens and your thoughts drift through familiar corridors, notice which phrases keep returning. Don't fight them. Don't push them away. Just ask, where did you come from? What face are you still wearing? And do you still belong here? Because not every echo is worth keeping, and not every thought that repeats deserves to become your truth. Confidence is often mistaken for truth. It arrives polished, articulate, unshaking. It looks like knowledge. It sounds like certainty. But confidence, like any illusion, can be inherited, imitated, or misplaced. You don't need to be right to sound sure. You only need tone, rhythm, rehearsal. And so, a strange paradox emerges. Confidence can exist without calibration, without accuracy, without depth, without connection to what's real. You've heard it before. The person who speaks with unwavering certainty about things they've never lived. The voice that dismisses doubt not with clarity, but with volume. The system that rewards presence over insight, assertion over reflection. The world that gives the mic to whoever speaks first, loudest, longest. You've seen how confidence, raw, unexamined, untethered, gets mistaken for competence. How it fills the room and pushes the truth aside. How easily we nod when someone sounds like they know. How rarely we ask, do they? But this isn't just about others. It's also about the voice inside you. The one that learned, perhaps too early, that being sure was safer than being open. That confidence earns space, even if it's built on sand. So you practiced it, you performed it, you wore it like armor. And maybe it worked. Maybe people listened. Maybe you were praised for knowing, for leading, for being decisive. Maybe it became part of your identity. You always know what to do. You always keep it together. You never hesitate. But inside, the calibration was off. You doubted quietly, second-guessed in silence, smiled while uncertain, spoke while searching. And over time, the dissonance grew. Because confidence without calibration, without inner alignment, creates pressure. You feel you must always know, always perform, always prove. There is no room for revision, for rest, for real exploration. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's you, or someone like you, who waits until they are sure, who doesn't speak until they've measured every angle, who doesn't offer their insight until they've tested it against every possible failure. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they respect complexity. And yet the room passes them by. The world mistakes their pause for absence. This is the quiet tragedy. The people most calibrated are often the least confident, and the most confident are often the least calibrated. We've built a culture that elevates speed over sincerity, noise over nuance, declarations over doubt. So you end up questioning yourself, not because your thoughts are flawed, but because they weren't delivered with a voice trained in certainty. You wonder why your insights don't land, why others seem so sure, why your quiet knowing doesn't echo the way theirs does. But here's the truth. Confidence is not a signal of truth, it's a signal of tone. And tone can be practiced, faked, marketed, inherited, rewarded. So the question is not, do I sound confident? It's, is what I'm saying calibrated to my experience? Is it grounded, earned, real? Calibrated belief is quieter. It acknowledges uncertainty. It adapts. It listens. It doesn't fear being wrong, because it's not pretending to be infallible. It's not about performing wisdom. It's about participating in it. It's about holding an idea loosely, letting it grow, evolve, clarify. That's what we're missing. Not louder voices, but slower ones. Not stronger opinions, but better questions. So what happens when you begin to recalibrate? You pause before repeating old lines. You notice the moments when you sound more certain than you feel. You ask yourself, is this something I believe or something I've just practiced saying? You start to build your beliefs from lived experience, not borrowed phrases, and it's humbling. Because confidence without calibration protects you from doubt. And doubt, when it arrives, can feel like failure. But it's not. It's refinement. It's the beginning of discernment. It's what tells you you're paying attention. Confidence that stays healthy is not the absence of self-questioning. It's the ability to question yourself without collapse. You start saying things like, I think, but I'm still learning. This is what I know, and here's what I'm still unsure of. I used to believe this, but I've updated my view. That's confidence too, just a different kind. The kind built from truth, not tone. And you begin to spot it in others. You notice who is leading from ego, who is repeating without thinking, who is bluffing. You stop envying their certainty. You start sensing their disconnection. And instead of mimicking them, you start honoring your own slower, deeper knowing. Because you're not here to impress. You're here to connect, to calibrate your understanding with the world as it is, not as it was told to you, not as it appears when shouted, but as it reveals itself when you pause, when you soften, when you actually listen. So tonight, as your mind winds down, notice the voice inside you that insists you must always know, the one that rushes to conclusions, that demands clarity before you've even had a chance to feel. Ask it gently, who taught you that certainty is power? And then ask, what would it mean to move through the world without needing to be sure first? Let yourself not know. Let yourself rest in the space between questions, because confidence without calibration may sound impressive, but calibration without the performance, that's wisdom. There are moments when everything looks fine on the surface. Your voice is steady, your posture is composed, you're saying the right things, doing what's expected, performing calm with impressive precision. But inside, something trembles. Something itches just beneath your skin. It doesn't scream. It hums. A quiet friction between what you say and what you feel, what you show and what you know. This is cognitive dissonance, the space between conflicting truths, the disjoint between belief and action, between feeling and appearance. And here's the paradox. The more skilled you are at maintaining calm, the longer that dissonance can go unnoticed, not just by others, but by you. Because calm is comforting, not just to those around you, but to yourself. It's a signal of control, of maturity, of intelligence. It tells the room and your nervous system that everything is under control, that you're above the chaos, that you've mastered the storm. But sometimes calm is just choreography, a surface layer performance that hides the turbulence underneath, and that performance becomes identity. You're so grounded, you're always so composed, you're the one everyone else leans on. You hear these phrases often enough and you start to believe them, not because they reflect your inner world, but because they reflect how well you've hidden it. And so the dissonance grows. You feel anxiety, but you label it as tiredness. You feel anger, but you translate it into confusion. You feel grief, but you wrap it in productivity. And it works. You keep going. You keep performing calm. But deep inside, a mismatch forms, a gap between what's lived and what's expressed. And here's where the damage begins. Because the mind doesn't tolerate dissonance quietly. It finds ways to speak, through chronic tension, through subtle resentment, through sleep that doesn't rest, through fatigue that doesn't explain itself. You're not falling apart, but you're not fully together either. You're drifting in the space between. The longer you paint over dissonance with calm, the harder it becomes to tell what's true. Your feelings feel abstract, blurred. You lose the sharpness of intuition. You stop trusting your reactions because they no longer align with the story you've rehearsed. And in time, the performance becomes reflex, automatic, unquestioned. You become a lighthouse that's never allowed to flicker. But even lighthouses need maintenance. So how did this begin? Usually in childhood, when emotion was tolerated but not welcomed, when anger was met with disapproval, when sadness made people uncomfortable, when disappointment earned distance. You learned early that calm made things easier for the people around you, easier for the environment that couldn't handle your full range. And because you loved those people, or needed them, you chose calm over truth, again and again, until calm stopped being a strategy and became your default. And now you struggle to tell the difference between peace and suppression. Now you interpret numbness as stability. Now you tell yourself you're fine when you're not even close. But there's a signal that remains, always. The dissonance, that tiny, persistent ache that says, something's not aligned here. And the goal is not to erase that ache, it's to listen to it, to treat it not as a flaw, but as a flag. Not as weakness, but as an invitation. You don't need to collapse the persona to hear your truth. You just need to stop protecting the calm at all costs. Let the mask slip, just a little. Let a moment of truth emerge, even if it's clumsy. Say what you're really feeling, even if your voice shakes. Let the calm crack. Not shatter, just crack, so that something real can come through. You don't owe the world serenity. You owe yourself sincerity. And sincerity isn't always composed. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's abrupt. Sometimes it's soft and strange and sad. But it's real, and it creates space for coherence. The kind of coherence that doesn't require you to divide yourself to keep the room comfortable. Because the greatest peace isn't found in performance, it's found in alignment. When your inner world and outer world match, even briefly, even imperfectly, that's when the nervous system exhales. That's when your body says, "Thank you. I've been trying to say this for years." So tonight, notice the calm you've constructed, not with judgment, with curiosity. Ask, what am I not saying because I've always been the one who stays calm? What truth have I painted over with quiet because it would have made others uncomfortable? Then listen, and if something inside you whispers, "I'm not okay," let it speak. Let it speak without needing to fix it, without needing to make it beautiful, without needing to wrap it in logic or silver linings. Let it be what it is, your real voice beneath the practiced tone. Because dissonance isn't proof that something's broken. It's proof that you still hear yourself. And that's where truth begins. Some dreams disappear the moment you wake. Others linger, half-formed, illogical, their meanings blurred like ink in water. But a few never fully leave. They stay beneath your routines, beneath the voice you use in daylight, beneath the expectations others wrapped around you. They press quietly against the shape of your life, like soft roots looking for light. These dreams weren't loud. They didn't shout for attention. They didn't arrive with destiny or grandeur. They showed up as flickers, as feelings, as brief moments of resonance when something in the world looked back at you and whispered, "Remember this." And maybe you didn't. Not at the time. You kept moving. You chose what was practical, what was safe, what was praised. You chose what fit. And in doing so, you stepped around something soft in yourself. Not deliberately, not with cruelty, just with the logic of survival. You told yourself, "I'll come back to this later." But later got crowded. Later became years. And yet, the dream didn't die. It fragmented, it scattered, it left breadcrumbs, traces of itself buried in your choices. A favorite book, a hobby you return to without reason, a strange longing when you hear a certain song, a restlessness in moments that should feel satisfying but don't, a tear you can't explain during a film no one else cries at. Breadcrumbs, left not by fate but by feeling, left not to haunt you, but to help you find your way back. Because some part of you remembers. Not the specifics, maybe, but the sensation, the orientation, the version of you that felt most like yourself before you were asked to make sense to others. That's what a dream is, not a goal, not an ambition, but a direction. An inner pull toward what feels vivid, alive, whole. But life teaches detours. It teaches negotiation. You learn to trade wonder for structure, imagination for credentials. You make compromises and call it maturity. And some of these choices are wise, necessary. Not all dreams are meant to be chased in full, but many are meant to be honored, carried, fed in small, secret ways. When you ignore them completely, something in you begins to ache, not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to make satisfaction feel unreachable, just enough to turn contentment into a kind of quiet hunger, just enough to make success feel incomplete, because success that isn't in conversation with your dream will always feel slightly off. You won't know why. You'll just feel tired, out of tune. You'll start to wonder if you're ungrateful. You'll say, I have everything I should want, but should is never the same as soul, and the soul doesn't care about optics. It cares about alignment. So how do you return to a dream you can't fully remember? You follow the breadcrumbs. You notice what lights you up, even when it's inconvenient. You trace the moments when time bends, when hours feel like minutes. You pay attention to envy, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a signal, a map. What have I silenced that someone else has honored in themselves? That question stings, but it also points, and pointing matters, because clarity rarely arrives in a single revelation. It arrives in glimpses, in fragments, in the quiet realization that what you've dismissed as irrelevant was, in fact, sacred. Sometimes it's a childhood fascination. Sometimes it's a skill you gave up because someone said it wasn't realistic. Sometimes it's a version of you that got left behind when responsibility arrived too early. They're not always meant to become careers, or legacies, or grand gestures, but they are meant to be reclaimed, even gently, even privately, even if the dream now lives in a different shape than it once did. Because dreams evolve. They're not frozen in time. They grow as you grow. They shape-shift. They adapt to what you can hold. A dream that once looked like a stage may now look like a letter. A dream that once looked like escape may now look like stillness. What matters is not the form. What matters is the feeling, the alignment, the restoration of the part of you that never stopped wanting. And here's the truth most people won't say. It's not too late. Not because the path will be easy, but because the part of you that dreamed is still alive, and that part deserves your attention. Not because dreams are owed fulfillment, but because you are owed wholeness. And wholeness requires you to stop pretending that the breadcrumbs were never there. They were, and they still are. So tonight, listen closely. Trace your attention backward. Back through the years, back through the shoulds and the expectations and the masks. Ask yourself, what have I always loved without needing permission? Then follow that. Not all at once, not recklessly, just honestly. Because when you begin to follow the breadcrumbs, you don't always end up where you expected, but you always end up where you belong. There's a voice inside you that doesn't sound like doubt. It sounds like structure, like reason, like a firm hand guiding you toward what's right. It doesn't shout. It simply states. And you follow it, not because it feels good, but because it feels established, reliable, confirmed by numbers, reflected in media, repeated by peers, echoed by algorithms. It must be right, you think. Everyone agrees. And that's where the paradox begins. The most powerful voices are often the ones you don't notice because they blend so perfectly into the collective. It's not your mother's voice, or your own inner critic. It's not trauma or nostalgia. It's something subtler. consensus, a silent majority inside your mind, a convergence of assumptions shaped not through insight, but through repetition, amplification, normalization. The voice says, this is success, this is failure, this is beauty, this is adulthood, this is how people should behave. And it sounds true, not because it was earned, but because it has never been challenged. You believe in it not as opinion, but as infrastructure. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because you don't push against what feels like air. You adapt. You measure your milestones by its standards. You critique your choices with its logic. You feel behind, not based on your own pace, but on someone else's timeline. You compare. You comply. You shrink into shapes that weren't designed for you, but you wear them anyway because the crowd is facing the same direction, and turning around feels like betrayal. But what if the crowd is lost? What if the voice isn't wise? What if it's just loud? Here's what consensus often hides: nuance, variation, interiority, the fact that truth doesn't scale easily, that what works for many doesn't always work for you, that success, when universally defined, becomes hollow, that safety, when outsourced, becomes obedience. You may have never asked yourself why you want what you want, why you fear what you fear, why you chase what you chase, because the voice in the crowd already answered for you. But whose voice is it? Marketing, generational trauma, cultural momentum, a social feed fine-tuned to profit from your agreement. When you start to peel it back, you realize how few of your desires are truly your own. How often your resistance isn't laziness, it's misalignment. You aren't avoiding the work, you're avoiding the framework. The one that tells you worth comes from visibility. That intimacy must follow scripts. That time must be optimized. That joy must be documented. You've followed these rules for years, and maybe you've achieved what they promised. Maybe you've checked the boxes, reached the ranks, collected the badges. But something still feels off. Something in you still aches, and that ache isn't failure. It's clarity. It's the soft voice underneath the crowd saying, I never agreed to this. That voice is still in you. Quieter, yes, but still there. It's the one that pauses when everyone rushes, the one that lingers in uncertainty instead of choosing sides, the one that asks questions when others demand action. It's the one that remembers what joy felt like before it was curated, what connection felt like before it was quantified. You don't need to reject the crowd entirely. This isn't about becoming contrarian for its own sake. It's about recalibrating your compass, not to what's loudest, but to what's real. That requires solitude. It requires silence. It requires stepping back from the performance of certainty and saying, what do I actually believe? And then, where did that belief come from? Was it modeled, marketed, mandated, or did it emerge slowly from lived experience? That's the difference between borrowed belief and embodied truth. One comes fully formed, easy to share, impossible to inhabit. The other takes time. It stumbles, it evolves, but it fits, and when it fits, the noise softens. Because the voice you're meant to follow rarely speaks in slogans. It speaks in sensation, in resonance, in the sense that something, not everything, not perfectly, but something in this moment aligns. So tonight, as the hum of collective thought fades behind you, listen not for what you've always been told, but for what's been quietly waiting underneath. Ask, whose voice am I still obeying? Then ask, what happens if I stop? And whatever answers come, let them be yours, even if they go against the crowd. Especially then, because the truth that doesn't require agreement is the one most worth following. Not all lies are sharp. Some don't arrive with conflict or contradiction. They arrive dressed as compliments, quiet expectations, familiar labels. They feel warm at first, affirming even. They feel like someone sees you. Finally, like you found a place. A version of you that's worth something. You're so strong. You're the smart one. You never let things get to you. You're always reliable. You're the one who keeps it together. And so, you learn to keep it together. To be the strong one, to be composed when unraveling, to be capable when overwhelmed. You smile as the mask forms, slowly, over days and years, not because you're pretending, because this is how you survive. This is how you stay chosen. The paradox is this: the lies that feel most like truth are the ones we were praised for becoming. You perform well, you adapt quickly, you show up as the version that earned approval, and then you forget there ever was a version before. But the body remembers. It remembers every moment you wanted to fall apart, but didn't. Every time you swallowed emotion to keep the peace. Every time you said, "I'm fine," when you were anything but. The lie doesn't feel like a lie because you've rehearsed it so well. You've become fluent in your assigned role. You've told yourself this is just who you are. But that's not identity. That's reinforcement. And reinforcement isn't belonging. It's endurance. What's most painful is not the role itself. It's the slow erosion of choice. You forget you have the right to be something else, to contradict the version people expect, to fail, to fall, to rest, to not always be good at holding it all together. Because now, any crack in the mask feels like a betrayal, not just to others, but to yourself. You feel guilt when you're not on. You feel shame when you can't keep up. You've internalized the compliments so deeply that stepping outside of them feels like weakness. But it's not. It's recovery. Because the soft lie isn't evil. It was a gift, misdirected maybe. It was someone trying to describe the best in you. But it became a blueprint, a rule. And now it's limiting you. Now it won't let you cry without apology. It won't let you say no without guilt. It won't let you exist without function. You've become useful, not whole. Beloved for what you offer, not for what you are. And it's exhausting. There's a voice in you now that says, don't stop. That says, if I fall apart, everything will fall apart with me. That voice has helped you survive. You don't have to silence it. You just have to ask it, do I want to live like this forever? Because beneath the soft lie is a softer truth. You are allowed to exist without earning it. You are allowed to be complicated, inconsistent, tired. You are allowed to have needs that are inconvenient, desires that don't fit the version people admire. You are allowed to want more than what your mask allows, and the people who love you will adjust, or they won't. But either way, you will breathe differently. You will wake up less tense. You will speak more slowly. You will laugh without performing lightness. You will grieve without narrating. You will remember what it feels like to simply be, not as a function, but as a form. You'll begin to unweave the identity stitched from praise. You'll feel awkward at first, unsure. You'll worry that people won't recognize you. That's okay. You're not here to be recognized. You're here to be real. Start small. Let the strong one be tired. Let the smart one ask questions. Let the dependable one say no. Let the calm one scream, not to destroy the role, but to expand it. Because you are not a role, you are not a performance, you are not the sum of others' comfort with your personality. You're a shifting, feeling, breathing human, and you deserve to be full. So tonight, as the edges of your consciousness begin to blur, listen for the phrases you use to hold yourself still. I have to keep it together. They're counting on me. I don't want to be a burden. I should be past this by now. Let them surface. Then ask softly, what if I don't? What if I let someone down? What if I need more than I've admitted? And what if that's okay? Because the lie that shaped you doesn't need to continue to define you. You can thank it, and then let it rest. Some beliefs don't just live in your mind, they live in your body. Not as abstract philosophies, but as postures, held shoulders, tight jaws, a breath that never reaches the bottom of your lungs. These are the physical expressions of your inner rules, the illusions you've carried so long. Your body adapted to them. You don't just believe them. You brace against them. You stand straight. You keep it all together. You carry yourself with quiet control, as if you are made of something stable, something dependable, something admirable. And maybe you are, but maybe, too, you're holding a position meant to survive belief, not express truth. Because here's the paradox. Some illusions are beautiful, clean, elegant. They hold you upright. They keep you moving. And that's the danger, because they work for a while. You are only lovable when you're useful. You are only safe when you're agreeable. You are only worthy when you're perfect. These are illusions with perfect posture, well-dressed, well-rehearsed, almost indistinguishable from integrity. But they are not integrity. They are armor, and armor is not the same as identity. You may not have chosen these beliefs consciously. They may have been woven into you through repetition, expectation, and the subtle reward of being easy to praise. You became the version of yourself that never made others uncomfortable. You refined your image, your tone, your timing. You became efficient at hiding the mess, editing the truth, smiling through contradiction. And what did it get you? Admiration, maybe respect, success, a sense of control, but also fatigue, disconnection, a haunting question in the back of your mind. What if they only love this version of me? What if the real me ruins it? So you maintain the illusion. You double down. You perfect the posture. But inside, the weight grows heavier. The need for effort grows louder. The distance between your performance and your truth becomes harder to ignore. You begin to feel it in strange ways. Not through breakdowns, but through tension. Not through crisis, but through apathy. You find yourself in rooms where you're praised and feel nothing. You meet expectations and feel emptier. You keep achieving, but the joy doesn't land. This is your body telling you something. Telling you that performance, no matter how graceful, cannot substitute for presence. That illusion, no matter how useful, cannot replace aliveness. But you can't just drop it, not all at once. Because illusion isn't just belief, it's infrastructure. It's what your relationships are built on, your role, your career, your image. and you fear that if you drop the act, the world you've built will collapse. Maybe it will. But maybe what collapses isn't your world. Maybe it's the performance you've mistaken for self. Maybe it's the version of you that never got to stop holding their breath. Maybe what collapses is the illusion, and what remains is the beginning of truth. You don't need to tear it down dramatically. This isn't about destruction. It's about softening, noticing where you're stiff, where you're guarded, where you're polished beyond recognition. Ask yourself, what part of me have I trained to look strong just to avoid being questioned? What smile do I wear when I want to disappear? What certainty do I project when I feel most lost? These are not accusations. These are openings into yourself, into the deeper, less tidy, more sacred self that doesn't need a perfect story to be worthy. Because posture is not the problem. The problem is when posture becomes prison, when you are so good at holding it all together that you forget how to let go, how to lean, how to collapse gently into someone else's arms without apology, how to be soft without losing value, how to speak messily, loudly, honestly. That version of you, the one beneath the illusion, deserves a voice, not just in your journal, not just in private, but here, in the body, in your breath, in your choices. So, what now? You begin slowly. Let your back relax when no one's watching. Let your breath deepen when no one needs you. Let your face go slack. Let your words stumble. Let your story be incomplete. Notice what beliefs resist these shifts. You can't fall apart. You'll be forgotten if you stop performing. You have to be inspiring or you'll be invisible. And then, question them. Not violently, not in a courtroom of right and wrong, just with curiosity. Ask, where did I learn this? Who needed me to be this way? What happens if I let this illusion soften, just for a moment? It may feel like danger, but it's actually possibility. Because you don't need to be graceful to be real. You don't need to be impressive to be loved. You don't need to posture to belong. You can bend, you can rest, you can cry without fixing it. You can say, I don't know, and still be respected. You can feel messy and still be enough. So tonight, as the day dissolves and your mind prepares to slip into its quieter dimension, notice where you're holding yourself too tightly. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And ask, what am I trying to protect? Then ask, is this armor still serving me? And finally, what if I laid it down? Not forever, just for now, just for sleep, just long enough to remember who I am beneath the illusion with perfect posture. Memory is a strange storyteller. It doesn't report, it interprets, it edits, it rearranges, and sometimes it invents. Not out of malice or dysfunction, but out of need. The need to explain a feeling, to justify a silence, to account for pain when no clear cause can be found. So the mind builds a bridge between what was felt and what can be recalled, and that bridge is called memory. But not every memory is true. Some never happened, not the way you remember them. Some were shaped by implication, suggestion, fear. Some were constructed long after the moment passed, their details filled in by what seemed likely or what had happened before. You don't remember the thing itself. You remember the narrative your brain created to protect itself from confusion. Here lies the paradox. Even memories that aren't factual can still hurt like they are. Because your nervous system doesn't fact-check. It doesn't care whether the words were said exactly that way, whether the moment unfolded as clearly as you think. If the emotion was real, the imprint is real. And once it's there, the body begins responding to it as if it's a verified truth. You find yourself avoiding certain places, certain people, certain kinds of touch or tone or attention, not because of what happened, but because of what your mind believes happened. You experience rejection in rooms where no one has spoken. You feel shame at the memory of a mistake you never actually made. You distrust joy because a memory reminds you that joy was once followed by loss. Except that memory might be fiction, or a distortion, or a dream so vivid it blurred with waking life, but that doesn't lessen its weight. The body still flinches, the breath still shortens, the thoughts still spiral. Because hurt, once accepted by the body, doesn't require accuracy to persist. And yet you question yourself. You say, I don't know if it was real. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I imagined it. You feel guilt for remembering what others forgot. You feel ashamed for being haunted by things that can't be confirmed. And the pain doubles, not just the original wound, but the self-doubt that follows it. But let's pause here. Let's offer a gentler perspective. What if the pain isn't evidence of delusion, but of sensitivity? What if your system picked up on something no one acknowledged? A pattern, a lack, a look, a tone, and your brain, starved for explanation, built a scene around it. Not to deceive, but to make sense of what couldn't be named. This is what unvalidated pain does. It echoes, it writes stories in the spaces others left blank. It tries to complete the sentence that never ended. And in doing so, it gives you a structure to hold your sorrow. So maybe you don't need to ask, did it really happen? Maybe the better question is, what does this memory protect me from? What does it say about what I needed but didn't get? What is the emotional truth buried beneath the factual uncertainty? Because emotional truth is still truth, and memory, even when inaccurate, often points to something important. A longing, a wound, a misunderstanding. It shows you what part of yourself was vulnerable, what part still is. This is where healing begins, not by proving the memory false or true, but by meeting the feeling it left behind. You don't need a courtroom to do this work. You don't need corroboration. You don't need the person involved to agree. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they can't. Memory isn't democracy. It's personal. It's intimate. It's shaped by who you were and what you were able to hold. And if you weren't able to hold much, that's not failure. That's humanity. You were a child when most of your emotional coding took place, or you were in pain, or overwhelmed, or confused. Of course, the mind built scaffolding. It needed a way to keep you safe. That scaffolding is still there. Some of it is made from real wood, some of it from shadows. You're allowed to revise it now, not to pretend it never existed, but to question what needs to remain. What memories are you still obeying? What warnings are still playing on a loop, not because danger is present, but because fear has built a home there? You may have flinched the first time joy returned, or love, or peace. You may have turned away from opportunities because a memory warned you they'd end in harm. You may have sabotaged comfort because a memory told you it couldn't be trusted. But what if the danger has passed? What if the memory was only trying to keep you from feeling abandoned, misunderstood, or hurt again? What if it did its job, and now it can rest? Tonight, ask the memory what it's still doing here, not with hostility, with reverence, with curiosity, with softness. Ask, what were you trying to tell me? Then listen, don't interrupt. Don't rush to disprove. Just listen, and maybe it'll say, you weren't safe then, or no one saw you, or you deserved comfort and didn't get it. These are not facts. These are truths, and they deserve your attention. Let the memory soften. Let the edges blur. Let the image fade and the feeling stay. That feeling has more to teach you than the scene ever did, because beneath every inaccurate memory is a very accurate need. To be seen, to be believed, to be held. And you can do that now for yourself. You don't need the memory to be perfect. You only need to be willing to meet what it tried to carry. That's how the healing begins. Not in the past, but here, now, with you. You scroll, you watch, you click, you pause. You hesitate for a second longer on a video, a post, a phrase that catches something deep in you. Curiosity, fear, longing, judgment. You don't say it aloud, but the algorithm notices. It makes a note. It learns. And the next time, it gets a little better, a little more precise, a little more tailored. And before long, you start to feel it. The world seems to agree with you. The beliefs you already hold are reflected back at you in cleaner language, prettier graphics, stronger certainty. You aren't challenged, you're confirmed. Over and over, the same opinions dressed in different clothes. You forget you're inside a filter. It just feels like reality. This is the paradox of modern belief. You're no longer just choosing your thoughts. Your thoughts are being chosen for you, not in the way of propaganda, not through force, but through personalization, through efficiency, through the quiet logic of engagement. The system doesn't ask what's true. It asks what you'll click, what you'll finish, what you'll share. And that pattern becomes your feed. That feed becomes your framework. And you, over time, forget that belief is meant to be messy. You forget that truth requires tension, that clarity is born through contradiction, that real thought is uncomfortable sometimes, unfinished, slower. But discomfort is bad for metrics. Ambiguity is hard to monetize. So the algorithm removes it. It gives you certainty, patterns, predictability, and belief starts to feel like a product, a brand, a consistent self you can display. You believe faster now, with more confidence, with less inquiry. But at what cost? You lose nuance. You lose the soft edges. You lose the slow forming of opinion over time. You start reacting instead of reflecting. You stop asking, what do I really think about this? And start wondering, what do people like me believe about this? Because now, belief is a badge, a signal, a shortcut to connection. And you learn, consciously or not, that you'll be accepted as long as you stay consistent, as long as you keep reinforcing what your audience, your circle, your algorithm expects. But belief, when it becomes performance, loses its root. You don't have to be a puppet to be manipulated. You only have to be unaware of how deeply your preferences are being reinforced, how consistently your biases are being fed, how often you're being told, not what is, but what you'll agree with. And it feels so good. That's the seductive part. To be affirmed, to feel aligned, to see your worldview reflected in every direction, to belong. But real belief doesn't come from echo. It comes from interruption, from sitting with the article that makes your skin bristle, from hearing the story that undoes your certainty, from staying with the idea that doesn't land immediately but haunts you with its quiet truth. The algorithm doesn't want you to do that, not because it's malicious, but because it's indifferent. It only wants you to stay, and certainty is sticky. So how do you find your way out? You start by noticing the pattern. You ask, when was the last time I changed my mind? When was the last time I followed a thought into discomfort? When was the last time I held a belief loosely enough to let it breathe? And then you give yourself permission to search again, not for what agrees with you, for what expands you. Read outside your genre, listen outside your bubble. Sit with someone whose life looks nothing like yours. Let them speak, let them contradict you, let them not entertain you, let yourself be unsure. Because you are not a brand, you are not a feed, you are not a fixed identity to be optimized. You are a process, and belief, if it is to remain alive, must be re-encountered again and again. Tonight, as you drift inward, ask yourself, how many of my beliefs were offered? Not because they were true, but because someone knew I'd accept them. Then ask, what might I believe if no one were watching? Not to be contrary, but to be honest, because the algorithm may know what you'll believe, but only you get to decide what stays. You can learn from words, but you learn more from what's left unsaid, from the pauses in a conversation, from the avoided topics, from the way someone's gaze shifts when you say too much, from the emotion that never quite finishes forming in the air. Silence teaches you. It teaches you what not to ask, what not to reveal, what parts of yourself are acceptable, and what parts should be hidden. It teaches you how to edit your truth in real time to keep the moment smooth. And most of all, it teaches you which parts of your experience will be welcomed and which will not. Not because anyone told you, but because they didn't. This is the paradox. We tend to believe that what we're not told doesn't matter, that omission is neutral, that only what's said out loud holds weight. But in truth, omission is formative. It shapes the voids in your understanding. It tells you where the edges are, where the map ends, and what lies beyond it you stop imagining altogether. You were never told that asking for comfort was okay. You were never told that being angry didn't make you unlovable. You were never told that saying no didn't require justification. You were never told that not knowing didn't mean you were failing. And so, in the absence of these permissions, you filled in the blanks. You shaped a belief. I must be self-contained. I must manage it alone. I must not need more than what's visible. You grew careful, efficient, palatable. You showed only the parts of you that fit the pattern, that matched the silence, that didn't require others to change. You called this independence, but it was something else. It was absence in disguise. And the longer you moved within these quiet boundaries, the more natural they felt. You forgot what it meant to ask without apology, to express without rehearsing, to need without shame. You believed your restraint was maturity, your invisibility was grace. But belief that forms in silence is rarely neutral. It comes with consequences. It makes your life smaller. It teaches you that safety lives in predictability, that your body must stay quiet to be allowed in the room, that your mind must stay within the lines drawn by people too scared to say the whole thing out loud. So you learn to disappear without leaving. You show up with half your voice, half your hunger, half your truth. And still, you're praised for it. You're so easygoing, you're so emotionally intelligent, you're so self-aware. They call it grace, but it's grief with good posture. Because deep down, there's another voice, a quieter one, a voice you buried when you realized no one would echo it. A voice that still wonders, why didn't anyone ever ask me how I felt? And the answer isn't cruelty, it's repetition. The people before you were shaped by their own silences. They learned to keep things in. They passed it down not by design, but by example. Their non-answers became your instructions. So how do you unlearn a silence that was never broken? How do you hear what was never said? You begin by noticing what you needed to hear. You ask, what would have made me feel more free, more safe, more whole? Would it have been, you're allowed to be angry, or you don't have to earn rest, or you don't owe anyone your agreement to be loved? These phrases, simple as they are, would have changed you, and if they never came, you can still give them to yourself now. Speak them, write them, let them exist in the world, even if it's only your voice that carries them. Because permission, once internalized, becomes foundation. It becomes a new kind of silence, the kind that's full of space, the kind that doesn't hold you in, but holds you gently while you expand. There's another side to this, too. It's not just about what wasn't said to you. It's about what you didn't say to others. All the times you nodded instead of questioning. All the truths you swallowed to keep things peaceful. All the versions of yourself you didn't express because you thought it would make you too much, too different, too real. That's silence, too. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is break it. Not with drama, not with anger, with honesty, with clarity, with a sentence that starts, "Actually, I don't believe that anymore." You will feel resistance. You will feel guilt. You will fear the gap between you and the people still speaking the old language of silence. But if you keep softening your voice, not shrinking it, they might start to hear you. And maybe they'll find their own unspoken truths waiting to be said. This is how the pattern breaks, one honest sentence at a time. Tonight before sleep, listen for the silence you've mistaken for reality. Ask, what did I need to hear that no one ever said? Then say it, aloud, in your head, on paper. Say it not to rewrite the past, but to revise the part of you that still believes it didn't matter. Because it did. What wasn't said shaped you, and now you get to shape the space it left behind. There is a kind of silence that arrives not from peace, but from saturation, not from stillness, but from suppression. You've heard it before, at the end of an argument where nothing was resolved, in the pause after a truth nearly escaped, in the breath someone takes when they decide, again, not to say what they're really feeling. It's the silence that doesn't calm. It accumulates, and over time it gets heavy. Not with sound, but with all the words that were never spoken, all the versions of yourself that stayed quiet, because it wasn't the right moment. All the feelings you muted because you weren't sure how they would land. All the instincts you silenced because they didn't match the narrative. The paradox is this: Silence is often mistaken for strength, but sometimes it's just exhaustion in disguise. You've learned to sit with things. You've learned to wait, to read the room, to pick your battles. You've become fluent in the unsaid, skilled at deciphering what's implied. You know how to be agreeable even when you disagree. You've mastered the nod, the half smile, the "I'm fine." You may not have noticed, but you've been performing a kind of containment, polite invisibility, strategic restraint. It looks like maturity. It sounds like grace. But beneath it, there's a voice whispering that maybe you've been too quiet for too long. The cost of unspoken truth isn't just misunderstanding, it's self-abandonment. Each time you chose not to speak, not to correct, not to reveal, you told a part of yourself, "You don't belong here. You're too much. You'll ruin the moment." And so that part shrank, got quieter, moved deeper into the background. But it didn't disappear. It just learned to speak in other ways. In anxiety that has no clear source, in restlessness that shows up in calm places, in the aching need to be alone without knowing why, in the sudden wave of sadness when everything seems fine. That's the silence speaking, not to harm you, but to get your attention, because inside that silence is the loudest truth. You don't want to be agreeable anymore. You want to be honest. You want to stop nodding, stop smoothing, stop living like your comfort is secondary. You want to say something real, even if it's messy, even if it contradicts the version of you people prefer. Because people will prefer your silence until you don't. And that's where things shift. The first time you say the thing you've rehearsed in your head for years, the air may get thick, the room may tense, people may not know what to do with your truth. But that's not a failure. That's an awakening. Not for them, for you. Because the moment you stop treating silence as safety, you remember how to speak without apology. It doesn't mean becoming loud. It means becoming aligned with your discomfort, your insight, your contradiction, aligned with the version of you that has been waiting for permission to say, "Actually, I disagree. Actually, I'm not okay. Actually, this matters to me." You may feel guilt the first few times. That's expected. Guilt is what happens when a boundary finally moves, when you take space in a room where you were only allowed to echo. But beneath the guilt, you'll find power. Not dominance, not control, but the power of integrity, the power of coherence. And coherence is what quiets the nervous system, not silence. So tonight ask yourself, where have I been quiet too long? What am I carrying that was never spoken aloud? What does the silence inside me actually want to say? Then let it speak. Write it down. Whisper it in the dark. Say it without needing someone else to understand. Because the point isn't to be understood. It's to be unhidden. To live without performing stillness. To exist without rehearsing invisibility. To speak, not because the room is ready, but because you are. Before the voice in your head had a name, before you learned which truths were acceptable, before words became identities and choices became roles, there was something else, a kind of awareness, unformed, unforced, just present. Not yet tangled in beliefs, not yet shaped by opinions, not yet folded into language. You were not a story then. You were not a reaction. You were not an answer to anyone's question. You were simply a thought. Not a thought you had, a thought you were. There's a paradox here. Because we build our lives on beliefs, we cling to them for shape, for structure, for selfhood. We use them to make sense of chaos. We confuse them with reality, and we defend them with everything we have, forgetting that they arrived late, after the breath, after the presence, after the silent knowing we can't quite explain but feel somewhere beneath the noise. That knowing wasn't taught. It wasn't proven. It wasn't voted on. It just was. It lives in the space before the first word. It lives in the gaze of a newborn, unburdened by concept. It lives in the feeling you get when you look at the stars and forget your name. It lives in the pause between two thoughts, when the mind stops chasing and just observes. You don't lose this knowing. You only forget to return to it. Beliefs pile on, stories stack. You become a curated collection of interpretations, and somewhere in that archive, the original voice gets quiet. The thought you were becomes the thought you doubt. But it's still there. And here's the strange, tender truth. Not every belief needs to be replaced. Some just need to be released. Because when the scaffolding falls away, what remains isn't emptiness. It's essence. It's not a blank slate. It's the ground everything was built on. You don't have to abandon your beliefs to return here. You only have to loosen your grip, to stop holding every idea like it defines you, to let truth arrive not as possession, but as visitation. Something to meet, not manage. Because beneath all your beliefs, beneath the lies you loved, the roles you played, the echoes you obeyed, there is a deeper self, one not interested in being right, one that doesn't need to win, one that doesn't shrink or rise with affirmation, one that simply is. It doesn't speak in languages, it speaks in stillness, in presence, in awe. And that's why this chapter has no lesson, no correction, no cognitive trick. It isn't here to convince you, it's here to remind you. You are not what you've believed. You are the space those beliefs moved through. You are the breath before the thought. You are the silence after the sentence. You are the awareness that never had to be earned. There is no narrative that can hold you fully, not even this one. So tonight, as the final page turns and the mind slows into rest, don't try to remember who you are. Just forget who you're not. And in the quiet that follows, notice what remains. That is the thought you were before belief began. There is no one moment when belief begins. It accumulates, layer upon layer, word upon word, a comment here, a lesson there, a rule unspoken but enforced by glances and pauses. And over time you begin to take shape, not from the inside out, but from the outside in. You learn to look at yourself through borrowed mirrors. You become the echo of what others think you should be. You gather traits like armor. You mistake opinions for direction. You forget to ask who you were before you needed to be understood. But there is a version of you untouched by all of that. A presence that never argued, never tried to prove anything. It didn't need to know where it fit. Because it wasn't trying to fit. It was just being, not passive, not void, vast, conscious, full of unnamed potential. You might remember it in flashes, not memories, but sensations. The way your chest opened during a childhood game when you were fully inside the moment, unaware of yourself. The way you stared at the ceiling in the dark, not worried, not planning, just there. The split second between breaths before a kiss. The hum in your body when the world disappears inside music, the silence between falling asleep and falling. That's where you still are. That's where you've always been. All the beliefs you built, they were scaffolding, beautiful sometimes, necessary even. But not the structure itself, not the core. The core can't be described because it came before description. It is the still intelligence behind the thinking, the witness behind the narrator, the truth that doesn't argue. You don't need to reach it, it's not far. You only need to stop trying to become something. That's the real end of belief, not when you replace the old ideas with new ones, not when you perfect your philosophy, not when you find the ultimate narrative. The end of belief is when you realize you don't have to be anything at all to be whole. You were whole before the question. You were enough before the label. You were real before reflection. This is what the mind forgets in its striving. That peace is not what happens when everything is understood. Peace is what remains when understanding is no longer needed. So now, here at the quiet edge of thought, you can stop looking for answers. You can let go of even the need to let go. You can rest, not in the arms of certainty, but in the warmth of being. No title, no role, no belief, only breath, only now, only you, before the story, before the voice, before the beginning. The thought you were still remains, still here, still quiet, still enough. Let the silence carry you now. You've remembered the way home,